The courtroom was filled with tension long before the judge even entered. Not the kind of tension that comes before a small verdict, but the slow, suffocating kind, where the air feels heavy as if every moment carried the weight of something irreversible about to happen.
Sean Diddy Combs has just filed a brand new bid to get out of jail before his sentencing in a few months. From arguing he shouldn't be locked up for his swinger lifestyle, to highlighting the atrocious conditions at the MDC, to addressing allegations of violence, he is fighting for his life in this new letter to the judge.
As cameras clicked softly in the background, their operators careful not to disturb the fragile silence. Reporters shifted in their seats, tapping on their phones and ready to send breaking news the moment the judge spoke. Ash. At the center of it, all sat Sean Diddy Combs, the music mogul, the entrepreneur, the cultural force who once seemed untouchable. His sharp, tailored suit looked almost too perfect, too deliberate, like armor against what was coming. Him from the weight of the decision about to fall? Diddy's eyes moved restlessly around the room, scanning faces in search of something, maybe reassurance, maybe escape, maybe just a sign that this wasn't real. His legal team sat close by, whispering at times, their expressions tight with a mix of worry and acceptance. They had fought hard, throwing every argument and every legal technicality they could into the battle. But deep down, they already knew.
Diddy Combs be released from jail? I know I've asked that question before so many different times here on Sidebar, but we have right now a brand new request from his legal team, a brand new filing from his defense team arguing for why he should be released now after that monumental verdict in his criminal case several weeks ago. The circumstances have changed, and I will tell you what, we did an interview a few weeks back that kind of previewed why and how Combs could be released. It was a bail bondsman that is apparently working with Diddy's team behind the scenes. I'm going to get to that a little bit later, but what I want to talk about right now is this latest letter from the defense to the judge overseeing this case, Judge Arun Subramanian. Remember, this comes after a jury of Combs' peers found him not guilty of racketeering conspiracy, not guilty of 2 counts of sex trafficking, but they did convict him of 2 counts of transportation to engage in prostitution. He's set to be sentenced on October 3rd. Technically, he could face up to 10 years in prison on each charge. Highly unlikely. I think maybe you might be looking at somewhere to 2 to 5 years potentially, but he could also get time served and be released, although that also seems unlikely. I'll talk about that a little bit later too. But initially, after the verdict, right after the verdict, his defense team petitioned the court that he should be released. He was just acquitted of some very serious charges. The judge denied it. The judge denied Combs bail once again. And remember, this comes after he was rejected bail multiple times since he was arrested back in September of 2024, highlighting the severity of the charges, the violence, and so forth. But now, this is different. Now, what is the defense arguing? I'm going to go over all this in the new letter. I'm going to give my take at the end about whether or not it's going to be successful and whether or not he will actually be released before sentencing in October. So, the defense begins by arguing that Sean Combs should be released in advance of sentencing, and the court has the power to do this. They have the authority, among other things, because you can clearly show, quote, that there are exceptional reasons why such person's detention would not be appropriate. So, what are those exceptions? What are those reasons? What are those circumstances that are exceptional? They highlight several things that we're going to get into. That the charges he was convicted of, we're going to call them the Mann Act violations. That's what it's called under the law. They're not as severe, they're not as egregious as other convictions in other cases. That the sheer fact that he's locked up at the MDC, the Metropolitan Detention Center, for the past 11 months, that in and of itself is a reason for him to be released. These are all exceptional circumstances, and I'm going to get into all the arguments. But first, they highlight the standard, and they argue that to be released under federal law, you need to show 2 conditions. First, the district court must find by clear and convincing evidence that the person is not likely to flee or pose a danger to the safety of any other person or the community if released. Second, it must be clearly shown that there are exceptional reasons why such person's detention would not be appropriate. Now, clear and convincing evidence is a lower standard, by the way. It's not like beyond a reasonable doubt. Anyway, basically, you have to show he's not a flight risk, he's not a danger, and you have to show there are particular, exceptional, unique reasons for why detaining Combs is wrong. We're going to start with the exceptional reasons justifying his release. And they begin by trying to define Well, what exactly is exceptional circumstances? What does that mean? And they argue that case law suggests a court has a lot of discretion to determine whether a particular set of circumstances qualifies as exceptions. And they say, look, Sean Combs, his case, so different from other ones. There has never been, according to them, a Mann Act prosecution like this one before. And this is how they lay it out. Quote, there has literally never been a case like this one, where a person and his girlfriend arrange for adult men to have consensual sexual relations with the adult long-term girlfriend.
Today was never going to be a victory lap. The bailiff's voice rang out, commanding, all rise. The judge entered, robes swaying with deliberate slowness, and every person in the room stood with eyes fixed forward, the collective breath of the space held in a fragile pause. The judge's face revealed nothing, not a flicker of sympathy, not a hint of satisfaction, just a blank professional mask. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for, the sentence. No theatrics, no dramatic speeches, just cold clear. Legal language. The charges were read, the reasons explained with almost surgical precision, the list long and the tone merciless. And then came the numbers years. Multiple years, with no probation and no suspended sentence. A punishment as heavy as the crimes the court declared proven.
Prosecuted and incarcerated under the Mann Act. Combs and two of his longtime girlfriends had a private, intimate life that is not uncommon today. They're talking about Jane and Cassie Ventura. Quote, it may not have been common on June 25th, 1910, when the Mann Act, or as it was originally called, the White Slave Traffic Act, was passed, but attitudes about sex and morality have come a long way in the last 115 years. It is worth noting that when the Mann Act was passed to protect the morals and decency of America's women were not allowed to vote. As noted below, perhaps due to the troubling background of this statute, whose history is rich with both racism and misogyny, the Department of Justice has limited its application to those people profiting financially from the business of prostitution and not using it to prosecute consensual adults for their own lifestyles. By the way, we covered this on a previous sidebar. The defense made an argument months ago to have these charges thrown out, called it basically racially motivated, that it was strange that it was being used against a successful black man. That argument didn't work. He was ultimately prosecuted and he was convicted on those charges. Went to swingers clubs and they had threesomes. Miss Ventura consistently expressed interest and enthusiasm in her intimate life with Combs, including what they called freak-offs. Jane and Sean Combs had threesomes too. When Jane and Combs watched pornography together, Jane testified that she contacted two different porn stars and invited them to join her and Mr. Combs. Both Miss Ventura and Jane testified that very often they would see the same men over and over again for years. In July of 2024, Jane testified, for instance, that she suggested to Mr. Combs that they call Paul. Jane explained that she told Combs she, quote, missed Paul. When asked why she said that, she responded, because I did. This was a lifestyle, one that both Miss Ventura and Jane chose, one they all, as grown adults, had a right to choose. Like many aspects of sex and intimacy, it was not without its complications, its bouts of jealousy, and at times, its frustrations. But that is a hallmark of any serious romantic relationship, and that is what these were, serious, long-term romantic relationships. By the way, not surprising they're really focusing on this because, again, he was acquitted of sex trafficking. They highlight how the jury didn't find sex trafficking of Jane or Cassie, that it didn't occur. There was no force, fraud, or coercion that was used to induce these women to engage in commercial sex acts. For transportation to engage in prostitution, what he was convicted of, the prosecution didn't have to prove that violence was used or that fraud was used or threats were used. It was just, did you transport these women and men for the purposes of sex work, commercial sex acts? And obviously the jury convicted him of that. And they highlight all the jury found was that there was prostitution, payment of porn stars and escorts. And they highlight that he is a swinger, or under the Mann Act, a John. And they argue he doesn't deserve to be locked up for this. Quote, Sean Combs should not be in jail for this conduct. In fact, he may be the only person currently in a United States jail for being any sort of John, and certainly the only person in jail for hiring adult male escorts for him and his girlfriend when he did not even have sex with the escort himself. Over the last 75 years, The White Slave Traffic Act has been limited to defendants who cause interstate travel for financial gain through the business of prostitution. That Sean Combs remains in jail for being convicted of being a customer of consensual adult sex services makes this case truly exceptional. Not only is prosecuting the users of adult prostitution services inconsistent with the Mann Act, it's inconsistent with the prosecution policy.
For a few moments, Diddy didn't move, didn't blink, didn't even seem to breathe. Stillness almost eerie, as if his mind had stepped outside his body to process what had just been said. Then came the faintest shift. His lips pressed tighter. His nostrils flared, his shoulders tensed. It hit him. This wasn't some drawn-out legal fight he could delay forever, nor an allegation he could dismiss with a carefully crafted PR statement. This was prison time. Real prison time. The kind of sentence that takes years out of a man's life and leaves him permanently changed. From the gallery came an audible gasp, a woman's quiet sob, and someone whispering, "Oh my God," under their breath. Diddy's family, seated directly behind him, clung to each other with wide, glassy eyes full of disbelief. One of them reached forward as if to place a hand on his shoulder, only to be stopped by court officers. His leader,
Matt Murphy, is with us. Matt, good to see you.
Happy to be here, as always.
Got to ask you your reaction to the verdict. Is it what you expected?
Well, hearkening back to, I don't know, we were talking about this, you and I, a couple of months ago, and I got to say, whether it's fun to be right or not in a case like this, we were both right. This was never a good fit for RICO for a lot of different reasons. And the consent element regarding the sex trafficking was always problematic. And I thought the prosecution here did a good job presenting their case. They did a good job presenting their theory. But when you match in a trial context, when you match like professorial and kind of plotting, which is the way a lot of government lawyers are, versus dynamic and engaging and that personality of the defense, it's always a mismatch. You're always up against it. And the Mann Act, like we talked about, I thought he was going down on that after like the second day of testimony. The problem is for the prosecution, the Mann Act is a very old law, and it was essentially legislative morality from about 100 years ago, where it was transporting prostitutes across state lines. The intent may have been good. It was essentially a very early version of sex trafficking, but it was really more an attempt to stop prostitution, which is, as we know, never going to happen. So almost every lonely guy in New York City who's going through a divorce, who is having a problem in a dating pool, who has some sex worker drive over from New Jersey, if he buys her Uber or his Uber, theoretically, that's a violation of the Mann Act. So that is it's not the same type of crime. There's no mandatory minimum under federal law. The judge does not have to. That. Right, they don't have to. Now, it carries up to 10 years per event, so he faces up to 20 years. The prosecution, I think, is asking for 46 months or something like that. They're asking for far less than that.
If the case was, if they had called, let's say, Christina Courtroom, okay, this chief of staff who had been mentioned, I think, by almost every witness, and she said, hey, listen, there was a criminal enterprise, okay? We were all a part of it. Everybody knew what the job description was. My job was to do this. His job was to do this. You think they would have gotten racketeering? If they didn't include Jane, who was arguably the more problematic testimony, I mean, Sean Combs still paying her rent, messages that she was setting up a lot of these sexual encounters. Cassie had messages too that were problematic that showed, if we're talking about whether she was a willing participant or not, but if you focus just on Cassie and you didn't call in Jane, or you didn't call in a Mia, or you didn't call in a Brianna Bengolan, if you limited the case, and now it's so easy to play, Monday morning quarterback or armchair lawyer here, but do you feel that the prosecution could have won this case if they structured it differently, if they called different witnesses?
That's a great question, and that's something that these prosecutors will literally be wondering for the rest of their lives, for the rest of their careers. They're going to be wondering if they'd done it differently, would the impact upon the jury and would the result have been different. The fundamental problem, I think, is that this was kind of always a round peg in a square hole. the arson, that domestic violence video that we all watched, that's horrific. All of that should have been prosecuted as state crimes in Los Angeles. That as a fundamental, starting point.
Well, they couldn't do it now. It was
They
time
take-
bar.
His lead attorney leaned in quickly, speaking in low, urgent tones, words like appeal and next steps slipping through. But Diddy only shook his head slowly, not in refusal but in disbelief, as if he still couldn't accept this was real. The judge didn't pause for the drama and kept speaking, laying out the legal reasoning, citing precedent, making it painfully clear that this sentence was no accident. It was intentional, meant to send a message not just to Diddy, but to the industry, the public, to anyone who believed fame could shield them from accountability, and it worked. Aside the courthouse, the reaction was instant and explosive. News outlets blasted alerts to millions of phones at once. Diddy sentenced 2 years in prison, the headlines screamed. On social media, hashtags tied to the case shot to the top of trending lists within minutes, and clips of the courtroom reaction began circulating. Grainy phone videos captured through the open doors, showing Diddy's expression shift from stone-faced to shattered.
RICO, as we know, was designed for essentially mafia organization, for organized crime. And the idea is simply because there's a legitimate business, like in The Godfather, they had a legitimate olive oil importing business, and that was but it was still a criminal enterprise. The real thing was the mafia. The real thing was the organized crime surrounding the Corleone family, to use an example that everybody can probably relate to. So simply because their olive oil importing business was legitimate, that's not a defense to a RICO thing. That's the current state of the law. What they did here is they took a business that was always legitimate, Bad Boy Records, that was always and the purpose is to make music and make money. Everything surrounded that, and the defense argument, which they obviously argued very effectively, was that is not a criminal enterprise. So the very first element of RICO has always been problematic from the very beginning. You and I talked about that 2 months ago when this whole thing started, and and the jury, this was a sober jury that the questions were serious and direct, and they sent that note out regarding juror 25 right at the very beginning, saying, "Hey, this guy's not deliberating," and so this was a serious group, and the Mann Act, they did convict on that, so they were. By the fact that that it was unanimous meant that they were getting along. Federal juries tend to be, in California anyway, we have. They draw our state juries off the DMV database. That's how you get jury duty, is from the DMV. Federally, it's based on voter rules. So it's people who are conscientious enough to actually vote. And you tend to get a more serious class of juror in federal court, which I think is interesting. So to answer your question, it's something that we could kick around for years.
Sure.
But I think the fundamental problem here is that it was always kind of a misfit for a RICO theory. Just like the sex trafficking, sex trafficking requires fraud, force, or coercion, right? So that essentially is the same elements of rape. So you essentially, it's transporting somebody under circumstances that equate to rape. Is something forceful, something fearful. That it just doesn't fit very well here, especially when you're talking about all these people they're orbiting him. They're all trying to advance their own career. And when the defense attorney got up and said, Cassie got $30 million as a result of her settlement, right? And that was a big move.
Yeah, I wasn't sold for that personally, because I was like, the prosecution came back and be like, she already settled. What's her incentive to come here and lie? What's her incentive to be a part of this? And that for me, but I think the messages, the conduct that arguably contradicts someone being a victim, and I know there's complicated factors between an abuser and a victim, the trauma, I get it. I totally understand it, but I wonder if that's what settled the jury. Okay, I want to move past the verdict because now we have to talk about what's happening next. First thing, when the sentencing hearing is going to happen. So they have this hearing next week about whether to expedite the sentencing, happening before October 3rd. If both sides agree, great. If they don't, what is a compelling legal argument for the defense to say, we want this sentencing to happen much sooner?
Well, I mean, we know that behind the scenes, what they want, of course, is they expect a chance that he's going to be released. So that's their big motivating factor, of course. Whether the court abides by that, I mean,
Everyone was analyzing it. Some saw arrogance finally cracked. Others saw a man broken. Supporters called it an injustice, while critics called it long overdue karma. Sean Diddy Combs, the music mogul who once stood at the very top of the entertainment world, now sat at the defendant's table, his tailored suit looking almost too sharp, like a fragile shield against the reality about to crush him. His legal team surrounded him, whispering last-minute reassurances. But even from a distance, you could see it in his eyes, the weight of dread. The judge entered, the room rose, and with a measured nod, everyone sat again. The proceedings began. Without theatrics, no dramatic speeches, or endless legal jargon. The case had already been fought, the verdict already reached, and all that remained was the sentence. Then the hammer dropped. The judge's voice was steady, but the words carried. The weight of finality, years, not months, not probation, but years behind bars. The details unfolded with cold legal precision, leaving no space for misunderstanding. This wasn't leniency. This wasn't a slap on the wrist. This was punishment, raw and unforgiving. For a moment, Diddy didn't move, just sat staring straight ahead, as if his mind needed extra time to process what he had heard. Then a flicker crossed his face, his jaw tightened, his nostrils flared into the realization hit. This was real. This was happening.
Often successful for the purpose of correcting when there's a clerical error in the sentence. Now, assuming Combs has valid legal grounds to support any of this, I imagine he will file whatever motion he can for relief from either the verdict or the sentence. Then again, I don't know. He got a very favorable ruling. Obviously, he was convicted. He's not entirely happy with it, and his defense counsel explained that. But they also, in their press conference after the verdict, they were jubilant. They were ecstatic. And I wonder if he gets a favorable sentence, is he even going to challenge this? I mean, they seem happy.
Yeah, they seem ecstatic because the emotions that kind of ran outside of the courtroom, it was kind of double that inside the courtroom, where all the defense attorneys were hugging, they were crying. So seeing them outside in the press conference, all kind of holding hands, going up, that was just a little slice of the cake from what we all saw inside that federal courtroom. But I think it can kind of go both ways, and that's mainly because Sean Combs is still behind bars right now. The judge didn't grant him bail even after the verdict, and I think his reasoning might give us a little kind of picture into what the sentencing might possibly look like, because the judge even pointed out during his denying of Diddy's bail after his conviction, which were on counts 3 and 5, kind of talking back to what had happened in June of 2024 with Jane and the violent altercation that happened over at Jane's apartment. And so I'm thinking, if the judge is already kind of on his mind about the whole domestic violence aspect and the physical violence that was exuded from the defendant, even just last year, I think it's possible maybe the judge, even if he hears from the family, even if he hears from Sean Combs' friends, that it's possible it might be kind of a little bit of a tougher sentence than maybe the defense was expecting.
Well, look, I think the defense might be wanting to take advantage of this, right? Now, the judge said, even though I'm denying bail and I'm looking at the violence factor, it's not a preview of what I'm going to do for sentencing. But I think this is the opportunity for the defense to submit any kind of mitigating factors and have the probation officer speak to his friends and family and talk about the impact of this. I mean, we just interviewed Charlucci the other day. So I wonder if they're saying, you know what? They said to Sean Combs, listen, let's wait for October. Gives us more time to present our case to Judge Arun Subramanian. And then we had the hearing today. This monumental hearing.
Great.
You've been in court for 8 hours a day, 10 hours a day.
Yeah.
This was what, like 7 seconds?
I think maybe even less than, I would say,
What
kind
happened?
of close to 5 minutes. So get all the way down to the courthouse. I'm like seeing everybody
Which
from
is not
the trial.
close from here, so people know.
It's not. It's not. And it was hot outside too. So
all the way downtown,
walking all the way down, or not, I didn't walk all the way downtown, from the subway to the walk to the courthouse.
Okay.
Get there, check in all my stuff. I would say the security check-in was longer than the actual hearing.
Okay.
So it was a remote hearing. We didn't see Sean Combs in person. We didn't see any of the attorneys on both sides. We didn't even see the judge. And so what had happened was we get inside kind of the overflow room.
Oh, the overflow room, okay.
Yep, so we get inside the overflow room. There's a big giant screen. It's completely black, but then you hear Sean Combs' voice being like, Mark, are you there? And so it was kind of like one of those dial-in type of hearings. And so we heard Mark Agnifalo's voice. Then all of a sudden we hear the prosecution's voice. It was Christy Slavic. She was accompanied by Emily Johnson, both who work on behalf of the government. And then all of a sudden, Mark Agnifilo was kind of like, you know what, we were able to work everything out as far as our sentencing date goes. And then the judge's clerk is like, oh, okay, so both parties agree, and then this matter is adjourned.
And that was it. I worried that's what was going to be, because when they had the letter basically working out the date, I was like, oh, what are they going to talk about? And then after that hearing is when they switched it back to October 3rd.
Yeah.
So not much there. You didn't see Sean.
The courtroom erupted, not in cheers or applause, but in a low, chaotic buzz of human reaction. Gasps of "oh my God" whispered through the benches, and a few muffled sobs broke from the public seats. Diddy's family seated directly behind him clung to each other with wide, disbelieving eyes as his lead attorney leaned in fast, whispering urgently, while Diddy shook his head slowly, almost imperceptibly, like a man trying to wake himself from a nightmare. He wasn't just shocked, he was stunned. This was a man who had built an empire, who had weathered decades of scandals and storms, would always manage to slip out from under whatever shadow threatened him. But this time, there would be no slipping away. The judge, unmoved by the scene, kept speaking, laying out the reasoning, citing the evidence, stressing the seriousness of the crimes. Each sentence, another nail in the coffin of Diddy's freedom, while the eyes of the world watched. Outside, reporters were already breaking the news live. Social media exploded, and within minutes, hashtags tied to the sentencing trended worldwide as clips of Diddy's reaction replayed again and again his stillness, his disbelief, the moment. The truth sank in. For supporters, it was a crushing blow. For critics, it was overdue justice. But for the industry, it was a seismic event, a warning shot, the fall of a giant. Because the truth was, this wasn't just about one man's fate. It was about the unraveling of an image, the shattering of the myth that some people are untouchable. And as Diddy was led out of the courtroom escorted by officers, the look on his face said everything. He was no longer the mogul in control of his destiny. He was an inmate in waiting, staring down the harsh reality of years inside a prison cell. While in the industry, the shockwaves spread even bigger. Because Diddy wasn't just another celebrity, he was a pillar of the hip-hop empire. A man whose network reached from artists to politicians.
Now, to be clear, my understanding is Judge Arun Subramanian even said at the point, if I make a decision on release, it's not indicative of where I'm leaning towards sentencing. I know there's a pre-sentencing investigation still being conducted or has been conducted. There's a lot of factors to consider. But I have to ask about whether this is going to, have an effect on sentencing. Do you believe it's going to have an effect on sentencing? Does it give you a preview of where the judge is lining up? Because my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, you are probably going to be arguing for time served, maybe a minimum of 21 to 27 months. Where do you think the judge is going to go here?
Yeah, I mean, I think that you have to take each step at a time, and that the judge is not going to prejudge that. There's a lot more information he needs to get, not only the pre-sentence report, but we're going to make a very fulsome sentencing submission, and he's going to have, a much more detailed picture. Even, the trial was about the charges, right? And he doesn't have the full picture of all the factors about Sean's life that he's going to consider. There's going to be a big fight about the sentencing guidelines. We think actually we're going to end up arguing for an even lower guideline range than we had originally believed at the time of the verdict, where we didn't have we had like a couple of hours to try to figure out what to say about bail. So, I hope the judge will grant bail, but I feel confident that even if he doesn't, it doesn't necessarily mean he's not going to sentence Sean to time served. He's going to take everything into account when he gets all the submissions. And, I've got a lot of confidence that the judge is going to be fair and not prejudge the situation.
And you also have this motion for judgment of acquittal, that the Mann Act convictions should be tossed out, Combs be granted at a minimum a new trial. Number of very interesting arguments that are present, and it's basically that there has really never been, as we talked about, a prosecution conviction on a Mann Act like this, that Combs wasn't profiting off of the business. There were all consenting adults that were involved. The jury didn't find that there was any sex trafficking, that this isn't even prostitution per se, it's more voyeurism, that the intent wasn't for people to travel for sex for money, but paid them for their time. They were all having a good time. There's a First Amendment argument that the freak-offs and the hotel nights were performances that were videotaped so he could watch them later. It's amateur pornography. There's an argument that he was prejudiced because of all the other evidence that came in to prove RICO or sex trafficking, but would never have come in if this was merely a prosecution for the Mann Act violations. Specifically, we talk about the Intercontinental Hotel footage. But couldn't the counter argument be, if you look at the text messages and voice notes and the travel, hotel, the payment documentation, that these charges, the Mann Act charges, could have been proven based on that evidence alone and not anything else about racketeering or sex trafficking?
Well, I think that goes, I don't agree with that. I think that, as we argued in the papers, the government didn't really show that the purpose of the travel was to have sex for money, and that in fact all the testimony and a lot of the other evidence showed that the men were being paid for their time. But even if we were wrong about that one, we have a number of the other arguments that you mentioned that really aren't undermined by those records. So for instance, one of our main arguments is that this statute, which used to be called the White Slave Traffic Act, it has this long history, but even with this long history, it's never been applied to a case like this. The term prostitution in a lot of states doesn't include this conduct, even if someone's being paid. If the person making the payment is paying essentially to observe other people having sex, that's not prostitution. So we have...
Her civil suit is still active, and all of her statements are admissible in that case. But some of the things she said on the stand may have weakened her position. She can still move forward, but if I were her lawyer, I'd be looking for a settlement. Figure there's also the perception that some people might just be jumping on the bandwagon for money. And most judges will allow the defense to raise that argument. Some cases may settle while others could go to trial. If they don't settle, his legal team will likely try to dismiss as many as possible. One possible tactic is to challenge anyone suing under a pseudonym, pushing the court to require their real names, which might discourage some from moving forward. Another option is filing motions to dismiss. The problem is, with so many lawsuits, over 60 each one, will need to be handled separately on its own merits. So he'll have to spend a huge amount on his legal defense. But compared to facing life in prison, that money becomes secondary. And he has a history of finding strong legal talent. The real question is what his career will look like afterward. Now, speaking of lawsuits, a new one was just filed 2 days ago in California State Court by Edmond Laurent, a former exotic dancer. He accuses Combs, along with a Jane Doe and others, of assault, battery, intentional infliction of emotional distress, negligence, sexual battery, civil conspiracy, aiding and abetting, and violating the California Civil Code, Laurent claims. He was a successful model, actor, and bodybuilder in the 90s and 2000s, appearing in music videos with stars like Tupac, Dr. Dre, and Britney Spears, and even includes pictures of himself with celebrities in his complaint. He says he rarely drank, didn't use drugs, and was friendly with Combs through video shoots, according to Laurent. He later worked as a male entertainer for bachelorette parties and was once called to an LA hotel where Combs and Jane Doe were, wearing masks. After performing a private dance, he says he was invited back a few days later when Jane Doe allegedly propositioned him for sex. And Combs reportedly said he wanted this and was turned on by watching a man with his girlfriend. Laurent agreed, and he claims the encounters continued, with Combs and Jane Doe eventually unmasking themselves, asking him to apply large amounts of baby oil, spiking his drink, and even on another occasion, having him use baby oil laced with GHB, and during sexual intercourse. Jane Doe allegedly broke the condom he was wearing on purpose with her fingernails. Despite him clearly saying he didn't want unprotected sex, he claims that from that point on, Combs' downfall spread far, beyond himself, threatening to drag others down with him. Whispers were already circling about who might be next, about what other secrets could come spilling out now that one of the gatekeepers had fallen. Then came the moment that will be replayed for years. Court officers stepped forward and Diddy rose, his hands instinctively straightening his suit jacket. Perhaps the last small act of control he would have for a long time. His eyes swept the room one final time, pausing on his family, then the press, then the judge. But there was no defiance left in his stare, only resignation. The sharp click of handcuffs echoed like a gunshot through the courtroom, and though he only flinched slightly, it was enough for the cameras to catch it. In that instant, the image of Diddy, the mogul, Diddy the untouchable, Diddy the king of the industry, disappeared. What remained was Sean Combs, inmate-to-be, walking toward a future he could not buy his way out of. As the doors closed behind him, the room finally exhaled. Reporters rushed outside, and fans and protesters pressed against barricades. While somewhere deep inside the courthouse, Diddy took his first steps toward a prison cell, and the world will not forget this moment, not just because a celebrity was sentenced, but because it was a rare glimpse of something many believe no longer exists: true consequences for the powerful. Diddy's career may never recover, his legacy may be permanently stained. And the story is far from finished, because if history has taught us anything, it's that when one domino falls in this business, others soon follow. The empire has cracked.